If you think war today is fought with tanks and missiles, you are already behind the curve. The real battlefield is quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. Because right now, power is no longer about who fires the first shot. It is about who controls the flow of money, oil, and access to markets. And here's the uncomfortable truth you need to hear. Entire nations can now be strangled economically without a single soldier crossing a border. What is unfolding in Venezuela is not an isolated crisis. It is a blueprint, a system where energy becomes a leash, finance becomes a weapon, and sovereignty becomes conditional, where the question is no longer who governs, but who is allowed to sell. And if this model works once, it doesn't stop there. So stay with me, because what happens next doesn't just reshape Venezuela. It quietly redraws the rules of global power, and eventually it reaches you. To understand what is really happening, we need to strip away the noise and look at the system underneath. This is not about Venezuela's government. It is not about ideology. And it is certainly not about democracy. This is about leverage. In the modern world, power belongs to whoever controls three things: access to capital, access to energy, and access to global markets. Missiles destroy cities, but financial controls decide whether a country can breathe at all. When oil is your only lifeline, whoever controls where you sell it controls your future. And when access to markets becomes conditional, sovereignty turns into a contract, one that can be revoked. That is the shift you're witnessing. Not a crisis, a recalibration of how power is exercised. Once you see this clearly, the individual events stop looking random. They start forming a pattern. And that pattern has a history because this strategy didn't appear overnight. It was built, tested, refined, step by step. This approach didn't emerge in a vacuum. It is the result of decades of trial, error, and strategic learning. After the Cold War, military dominance was unquestioned, but political costs were high. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, overwhelming force, fragile outcomes. So the system adapted. Instead of invading countries, power began to surround them. Instead of occupying territory, it targeted arteries, energy revenues, financial channels, shipping lanes. Oil exporting states became especially vulnerable. When one commodity funds your entire government, cutting access to buyers is more effective than bombing infrastructure. This is where Venezuela enters the picture. A nation rich in oil, but dependent on selling it abroad. A government that survives not through productivity, but through export permission. Once you recognize that dependency, the strategy becomes obvious. You don't remove the state, you squeeze it slowly, legally, systematically. And when pressure builds inside the system, something always breaks. That moment when theory turns into action is where the real crisis begins. Theory becomes real the moment enforcement begins. And enforcement doesn't start with speeches. It starts at sea. 2 oil tankers, one of them pretending to be Russian. Weeks of quiet movement, trying to slip through the cracks. But there are no cracks anymore. When the ship was seized, the message wasn't subtle. It wasn't diplomatic. It was structural. Flags no longer protect you. Cover stories don't matter. What matters is whether you are allowed to move oil at all. This wasn't about a single vessel. It was about demonstrating visibility, real-time awareness of global shipping, and the willingness to act anyway. And that's the moment the system reveals its teeth. Because when enforcement is selective but decisive, fear spreads faster than sanctions ever could. Shipping insurers hesitate, buyers back away, partners reconsider. If you're watching closely, this is where pressure shifts from the outside to the inside. And once that happens, the next phase isn't military. It's political. What looks like enforcement is actually something deeper, system design. This isn't about stopping oil. It's about controlling permission. In the old world, sovereignty meant owning your resources. In the new world, it means being allowed to monetize them. That is the mechanism at work here. By controlling access to buyers, insurers, shipping routes, and financial settlement, power doesn't need to overthrow governments. It simply decides who can function. Oil becomes unusable without approval. Revenue dries up without a single shot fired. And the pressure doesn't come from abroad, it comes from inside the system itself. Elites lose income, institutions lose funding. Loyalty weakens. This is how economic coercion replaces invasion. It creates a dilemma for everyone involved. Comply and survive, or resist and collapse. And once this structure is in place, it scales effortlessly. One country becomes a test case, others become warnings. That's why this moment matters far beyond Venezuela. Because when a system proves it can turn resources into leverage, it doesn't remain localized. It expands. And the next escalation doesn't target ships. It targets alliances. The second crisis doesn't arrive with explosions. It arrives with isolation. Because once enforcement works, something more dangerous happens. Partners disappear. Tankers stop answering calls. Buyers hesitate. Banks delay transactions. Insurance quietly vanishes. And suddenly, oil still exists, but it can't move. This is the moment regimes underestimate. They assume allies will step in. Russia, China, Iran. But alliances sound stronger on paper than they are under pressure. When ships are seized and routes are monitored in real time, protection becomes expensive. And when protection becomes expensive, loyalty becomes negotiable. That's when the system tightens. Discount oil no longer compensates for risk. Political alignment no longer guarantees access. Every deal becomes a liability. And here's the critical shift. The crisis stops being external. It moves inward. Revenue gaps turn into budget crises. Budget crises turn into elite fractures. And fractures turn into political instability. This is not chaos. It is sequencing. And once instability reaches the population, the story changes again. Because the next question isn't about power. It's about people. And this is where the system stops being abstract. Because when revenue collapses, it doesn't hit spreadsheets first. It hits lives. If you live inside that economy, you feel it immediately. Prices rise. Services vanish. Wages fall behind inflation. You didn't change policy. You didn't choose alliances, but you pay the cost anyway. This is how pressure is transmitted from markets to ministries and from ministries to households. And the most dangerous moment isn't desperation, it's disillusionment. When people stop believing tomorrow will be better, loyalty erodes faster than any sanction could enforce. Trust fractures. Institutions hollow out. The social contract thins. This is why economic warfare is so effective. It doesn't need fear. It creates exhaustion. If you've ever wondered how systems collapse without invasion, this is it. So pause for a moment. Ask yourself who absorbs pressure when power plays games at this scale. Because what begins as geopolitics always ends with people. And once it reaches that stage, the consequences no longer stay local. They ripple outward. Once pressure reaches this stage, it no longer belongs to one country. Because oil doesn't just fuel governments, it fuels systems. When flows are disrupted, prices react. When prices react, supply chains tighten. And when supply chains tighten, inflation spreads far beyond borders. This is how a local enforcement action becomes a global signal. China feels it through energy security. Iran feels it through constrained exports. Europe feels it through volatility, and emerging markets feel it through rising costs they cannot absorb. More importantly, every government is now watching the same lesson unfold. Resources are no longer neutral commodities. They are permission-based assets, and that changes behavior. Countries start hedging. Alliances become transactional. Energy policy turns into security doctrine. This is the quiet transformation of geopolitics, from diplomacy to system management. Once a precedent is established, it doesn't need repetition. It only needs visibility. That's why this moment matters globally. not because of what it stops today, but because of what it enables tomorrow. And when systems enable power this efficiently, the final question is unavoidable. What comes next? Because the future isn't fixed, it branches. From here, the system splits into three possible futures. The first is controlled adaptation. Pressure forces negotiation. Access is restored under conditions. Oil flows again, but under supervision. Stability returns, not because sovereignty is respected, but because compliance is rewarded. The second is prolonged stagnation. No collapse, no resolution. Just a slow grind of isolation, declining capacity, and institutional decay. A country frozen in limbo, surviving but never recovering. The third is rupture. When internal fractures deepen and external pressure remains absolute, systems snap. Elite consensus breaks. Street pressure rises, and change comes not through planning, but through exhaustion. None of these outcomes are accidents. They are design paths. This is what modern power looks like. It doesn't dictate outcomes, it shapes probabilities. And the most dangerous part is this. Once a system learns it can control futures without war, it will reuse that logic elsewhere. Different country, different resource, same mechanism. So the real question isn't which path Venezuela takes. It's whether this model becomes the new normal. Because if it does, the final chapter isn't about them. It's about all of us. And that's where this story ends. So here's the insight you're meant to take with you. Power no longer needs permission to be violent. It only needs systems that deny access. When money, energy, and markets become conditional, sovereignty becomes fragile. Not because states disappear, but because choices do. Venezuela is not the exception. It is the demonstration, a world where resources decide loyalty, where markets enforce alignment, and where war is replaced by calibration. This model feels clean, efficient, bloodless, but make no mistake, it reshapes lives just as decisively as conflict ever did. And once this logic proves effective, it won't remain regional. It will be copied, refined, expanded. The next crisis may not involve oil. It may involve minerals, or data, or food. So if you want to understand the future of global power, don't watch the battlefield. Watch the systems. If this analysis helped you see the pattern more clearly, stay with me, because the next video breaks down where this model is heading next and who will feel it first. This story isn't over. It's just beginning.